Thank you all for joining us online for this virtual Candlelight Vigil to commemorate the 31st anniversary of the Tiananmen Square Massacre. A few days ago, we received a letter from the Tiananmen Mothers, a group who has gathered ever since June 4th, 1989 to remember their sons and daughters who were slain by the People's Liberation Army. They let us know that once again this year, their cause for justice and their attempts to gather to remember their loved ones and have a moral reckoning have been denied and fallen on deaf ears. Since 1989, given the total lack of information allowed about the events of 1989 in mainland China, it has fallen to the people of Hong Kong, who've picked up the mantle of memory every year in the world's largest Tiananmen Square Vigil. This year, however, Hong Kong authorities have denied the permit requested under pressure from Beijing and denied the Tiananmen Square Vigil this year. And so on the 31st anniversary, it falls to all of us, to people in free countries who have the ability to speak, to pick up the mantle of memory, to remember Tiananmen. In our program, we'll be joined by Dr. Lee Edwards, co-founder and chairman of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, as well as 3 survivors of the Tiananmen Square protests and massacre, Dr. John Lee Yang, Dr. Dan Wang, and Dr. Bob Fu. We'll also be joined by Chen Qiushi, the barefoot lawyer and a human rights activist, and Benedict Rogers, chairman of Hong Kong Watch. We'll also announce our Human Rights Award.
Good evening, my friends. I'm so proud that I'm able to be here as chairman of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and to commemorate once again those brave pro-democracy students who died in June of 1989. I think I've been here almost every single year that you had this Candlelight Vigil. I'm honored and proud to join you and to say that we will keep having these vigils, keep lighting the candles until that inevitable day, which I believe will come, when China will be free once again. You know, people sometimes ask us why we picked the goddess of democracy as the icon at the center of our Freedom Plaza. And we debated it long and hard, whether or not perhaps we might have some remnant of the Berlin Wall, or perhaps some of the skulls from the killing fields of Cambodia, or a tiny boat like those used by those who were fleeing from Cuba and from Vietnam. But we picked the goddess of democracy for 2 reasons. Number one, because it is a symbol of what the communists will do, that they will go to any length, including murdering hundreds and thousands of young people to maintain their hold on power. But more importantly for us, we believe, it is a symbol of that passionate desire for freedom which beats within the breast of each and every human being. And so we come together each June, and I believe, and I think you agree with me, that it brings us that much closer to when communism will be dumped on the ash heap of history. And I think each year brings us that much closer to that day, to that inevitable day, when China will be free once again.
Hi everyone, this is Bob Fu. I'm the founder and president of China Aid. 31 years ago, along with hundreds of thousands of fellow Chinese students and citizens, I was one of them sitting in the Tiananmen Square, peacefully protesting and appealing for more democracy, more freedom, and more respect of human rights and rule of law. Yet, the Chinese communist regime sent military tanks and machine guns and killed hundreds, if not thousands of them. And the Chinese Communist Party has been claiming in the past 31 years that nobody had been killed in the Tiananmen Square. They are good at telling lies and covering up. And a year ago, the Chinese Communist regime unleashed this coronavirus, the Communist Party virus, to not only inflict millions of Chinese, and now are still inflicting millions, hundreds of millions of citizens around the globe. And yet, the Chinese Communist regime is still denying the origin of the virus, the cause of the virus, the extent of the virus, and other scientific data of the virus. So they are continuing the same pattern of lying, covering up, and inflicting so many millions of lives. Because of that, millions of American children and throughout the world are not able to go to school. Millions and millions of moms cannot send their children, cannot bring their children to churches, to synagogues, to mosques. This is a crime against humanity. Here at the 31st anniversary of this massacre of Tiananmen Square, please join us at China Aid and other organizations to hold the Chinese Communist Party and this evil regime accountable. Stop lying.
各位朋友大家好。中共6次屠杀31年了，很遗憾的是，中共邪恶政权依然在中华大地上肆虐，依然在那里不断的用残暴的残酷的手段来镇压那里的人民，来迫害中华儿女。那么我们不仅不能忘记中共6次屠杀对这30年来中共不断迫害中国人民的一桩桩一件件的罪责都要记录在案，准备追责清算。那么尤其是现在世界形势已经发生了根本的变化，绥靖政策已经走到了尽头，在全世界各民主国家，越来越多的人们认清了中共邪恶政权的本性，认清了中共邪恶政权的存在不仅仅是在践踏迫害生活在中华大地上的那些人民，它的存在是对全球各国人民的自由、安全和健康都构成莫大威胁的时候，我想每一个朋友，我们应该尽我们的所能来推动全球各方面的力量，携起手来，去把中共这个邪恶政权扫进历史的灰烬。那在这样一个非常关键的历史时刻，也考验着我们各方面的力量，也考验着人性。总而言之，中共这个邪恶政权不灭，世人就不会有真正的安全和自由。那么在全世界都认清这一点的时候，我想我们大家携起手来推动，可能比以前更为的容易一些。当然，最终中国人能否摆脱共产专制的这个磨难，能否摆脱专制政权在中国人民身上下的魔咒，还要靠中国人自己不断的努力。谢谢朋友们。
31 years ago, thousands of courageous people took to the streets of China, demanding their basic freedoms, human rights, and democracy, and an end to the brutal rule of the Chinese Communist Party. On this day, June the 4th, 1989, the Chinese Communist Party responded with typical brutality, inhumanity, and brutality by launching the crackdown that became known as the Tiananmen Massacre, killing unknown thousands, arresting and torturing and beating and injuring thousands more. I join with others today in commemorating that tragic and important event, but also in honouring those who gave their lives on June the 4th and in the days after it, either literally or by spending many years in China's jails subsequently. I salute the mothers of Tiananmen who have courageously kept the memory of their sons and daughters alive by speaking out despite the risks, and who continue to mourn their children who sacrificed so much. And I salute the victims of Communism Foundation for tirelessly, year after year, not only keeping alive the memory of Tiananmen, but highlighting the continuing appalling human rights situation in China today. Over the last 8 years in particular, since Xi Jinping took power in 2012, the human rights situation has intensified to an entirely new level. The Chinese Communist Party has always been repressive, but there were, at least in past years, some periods of relative relaxation, relative space, albeit limited, for civil society, for human rights lawyers, for bloggers. That is not the case today. The human rights situation in China today is often described as the worst since Tiananmen, and in some respects, particularly in regard to religion, the worst since the Cultural Revolution. At least 1 million, perhaps as many as 3 million Uyghurs incarcerated in prison camps. The basic freedoms that the city of Hong Kong has until now enjoyed being decimated by the Chinese Communist Party. Bloggers, lawyers, doctors, whistleblowers, dissidents disappearing almost every day simply for expressing disagreement with Xi Jinping or some criticism of him. The human rights situation in China today is in crisis. And it is time that the international community woke up to that. We've seen the dangers of the Chinese Communist Party in our own streets because of the coronavirus pandemic that was unleashed as a result of the regime's decision to repress the truth rather than to repress the virus. And that is symptomatic of this regime's rule. So we owe it to the brave people who stood for freedom 31 years ago, not only to remember them and to honor them, but to continue the fight for which they gave their lives and to work for freedom and human rights for all the peoples of China.
Thanks to the victim of Communist Memorial Foundation for inviting me to this event. At the time when the COVID-19 epidemic is still serious, it's grateful that Americans have not forgotten June 4th. So on behalf of my friends who participated in the 1989 democracy movement, I thank you all. In 1989, Chinese students and people took to the street to fight corruption, to demand democracy. Their appeal was bloodily suppressed by the Chinese Communist Party, and a large number of people were killed. This is a historical wound that has been bleeding for decades. We must reserve historical memory as a means to resist totalitarianism and continue to fight for democracy. Meanwhile, we also need to acknowledge that after the crackdown of 1989 democracy movement, China embarked on a path to the rise of the so-called great power. This path, on the surface, brought China economic growth and the improvement of living standard. But on the other hand, 31 years of development has increasingly proved that such a China model is in contradiction to civilization and democracy. It's a wrong way that not only limits China's development, but also hurt the national interest of Western countries, especially the United States. We must recognize that the United States and the rest of the world will pay a greater price in the future if China's communist regime remains the same. Therefore, it's not only a matter of China, but the whole world to pay attention, to push for the regime change in China. Now the CCP is trying to suppress the democracy movement in Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong. They are also interfering in the democracy of Taiwan. CCP are also trying to expand their international influence to replace liberal democracy with China model. Facing such threats, I call on all of you to work together to support the democracy movement in China and resist the conspiracy of the Chinese Communist Party around the world. All this effort would be the best tribute to the people who sacrificed for the democracy of China 31 years ago. Thank you.
As the worst pandemic in modern history continues to plague the world, we once again observe the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square Massacre. On this day, I have been thinking about the connection between the two seemingly isolated tragedies 31 years apart. The brave students in Tiananmen Square demanded political reforms to make the government more transparent and responsible. But the Chinese Communist regime responded with machine guns and rolling tanks. As a result, political reform ceased, and the government has become even more blatant in its repression and corruption. Today, 31 years later, it is a well-established fact that when the coronavirus first broke out in Wuhan, there had been any space in society and government to sound the alarm, if the government had not suppressed the truth and misled the world, hundreds of thousands of lives would have been saved. By the same token, if the Chinese Communist regime, instead of slaughtering the Tiananmen protesters, had accepted their request for political reform, the world would not have been plunged into the catastrophe we are experiencing today. This is an example of the principle that when a regime runs roughshod on its own people, it will sooner or later bring disasters beyond its border one way or another. Everyone should be reminded of this lesson. The difference made by freedom and democracy is not only whether we have a life of dignity and of individual fulfillment, but often the difference between life and death. The people of Hong Kong know it well. Carrying on Tiananmen spirit, they are putting their lives online to defend their freedom and push for democracy. Under the cover of the pandemic, Beijing is intensifying crackdowns on the people of Hong Kong, aiming to kill their hope by suppressing the space for freedom of expression to zero, as they did 31 years ago in China. But the people of Hong Kong will not give up. They will fight through to a free future. So will we. Today, there can be no better way to commemorate our fallen brothers and sisters 31 years ago than standing with Hong Kong. Today, our memory is not just a sad recollection. Our memory concerns life and death. Whenever we think of the young lives lost and of many unnecessary deaths today, we need to challenge ourselves to ask how we can live so those sacrifices will not have been in vain. Let us work together to ensure they were not. Rest in peace, my dear brothers and sisters of Tiananmen. Rest in peace, our fellow human beings who died of the coronavirus.
The courage of the victims and survivors of the Tiananmen Square protests have inspired a new generation of freedom fighters. One of those is Chen Qiushi, a citizen journalist who came to the world's attention last year when he traveled to Hong Kong in an effort to cover the pro-democracy protests that were happening there for a Chinese audience on the mainland. Most recently, he traveled to Wuhan to try to uncover the facts that were being hidden and denied by the Chinese Communist Party about the coronavirus early in the outbreak. He was detained on February 6th and been disappeared since then. Here to accept our Human Rights Award in his place is French journalist Ursula Gauthier.
Thank you. I would like to thank Marion Smith, Director of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, for allowing me to take part in this very moving ceremony. I'm honored to represent Chen Qiushi, an extraordinary hero of journalism and of the struggle for truth, and to accept the VOC Human Rights Award on his behalf. Chen Qiushi is not a professional journalist. By training, he's a lawyer. I discovered him first in 2019 in a video where he explained that he had to travel to Hong Kong to see for himself and to show the Hong Kong demonstrations to his compatriots in an unbiased way, noting that the Chinese public only had access to news distilled by the authorities. As a result, he was questioned and his social network accounts were blocked. When I saw him reappearing in Wuhan on January 23rd, I was torn between concern and admiration. There was panache in his decision to go into the furnace alone as a citizen journalist when there were so many professional media organizations who were evacuating. As he said in one video, there are about 200 investigative journalists left in China, none of whom had made it to Wuhan. Like the 430,000 subscribers to his YouTube channel, I watched in shock as he showed images of the city under harsh quarantine, queues of sick people waiting to be tested, people who had lost relatives to the disease. He was not protected enough, wearing only a mask, and goggles. In a video from January 30th, he appears somewhat undone, sitting on his hotel bed in an undershirt, with his hair tousled. He said he was afraid of the disease, and also that he was harassed, and that he would never bow to pressure. He uncovered important information that already in December, taxi drivers were discussing a SARS-like illness, that the local Red Cross was so corrupt that donors were sending their donations directly to the hospitals, that hospitals in Wuhan were so crowded that people were lying and sometimes dying in the hallways. And then he disappeared on February 6th. His mother was informed that he was being held in an unknown location for quarantine purposes. A particularly long quarantine, almost 4 months. After having muzzled professional journalists, Beijing is now silencing the solitary voices that still want to tell the truth to their compatriots. The foreign press is not immune. In November 2015, the authorities took umbrage at an article in which I reported on discriminatory policies towards Uyghurs and demanded an apology from me. As I refused, they preferred to expel me. And they have since refused me a visa. Since then, millions of Uyghurs have been imprisoned in concentration camps. The number of foreign journalists expelled has almost reached 24. China is sinking into a denial of information, a denial of justice, and a denial of humanity. It is therefore more necessary than ever for journalists to do their job. When individuals go in alone like Chen Qiushi, their risk is tremendous. That is why foreign media, which are so much freer and more powerful, have the duty to continue to cover China and to support our Chinese colleagues. Each person who has a conscience and is fortunate enough to live in a free society has a duty to support the media that continue to do this vital work. He or she can also support all those who are fighting for the release of journalists around the world. I would like to finish by addressing Chen Qiushi. Dear colleague, I hope that you will be released soon. I hope that professional journalists will be able to cover the reality of your country so that you can return to your profession as a lawyer. I wish I too could return to China to do my job. Until we meet in Paris or in Beijing, I will keep your price safe. Thank you.
The Chinese government has made its move and appears ready to crack down hard on the student protesters. At this hour, no one is sure where it's all headed.
But Li Peng, the Chinese premier, was on the way up to make a hard speech, saying student protests would be ended by force.
The Chinese government is now blocking all satellite transmissions of TV pictures.
Witness accounts and records of the tragedy in Tiananmen Square are absent from textbooks and classrooms. Mention of the student movement is scrubbed off China's internet.
The government tried to clean away the evidence of the movement and its suppression. People stopped talking publicly about what they had seen and done in the spring of 1989.
Every year on the evening of June 3rd, we gather at the Victims of Communism Memorial in Washington, D.C., and at other places around the country, as Americans, to show our solidarity with our brothers and sisters in China. and especially with those who survived and the family members of those who were slain in the brutal crackdown that took place in Tiananmen Square and other places around China in 1989. This year, I hope you'll join us wherever you may be to light a candle in memory of Tiananmen.